All right, welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The War Widens, 1914 to 1915. So, by the time you get to November 1914, there's a feeling that the war is going to last a bit longer than what folks had originally sort of thought, which, sometimes is fairly common as far as wars go. And what this means is you're going to start to see it affect nations all over the world. You're going to start to see different alliances get called in. You're going to start to see the mobilization of different populations. So the first term for us to know would be Belgian refugees. I think that for many of us, the lasting images that we have of war in Europe are going to be trench warfare, no man's land, the Western Front, and all of that. And rightly so. But we need to also engage with images around that. And as the German army moved into northern France, of course, they came to consume most of the modern nation of Belgium. And what this did, of course, was it picked up and forced many Belgians to attempt to flee, some of whom are able to make it to France, to French lines, but others are not. And what this means is many of them are going to be now part of an occupied Belgium, which is under German rule. And many of them are going to be used as laborers for the German war effort. It's something like over 1.5 million Belgians are displaced here, and over 120,000 of them are going to be forced laborers for the German occupation or for the German war effort here. So their experiences are something that we should acknowledge. Secondly, the Mexican Revolution. Right, the Mexican Revolution. The revolution that begins in Mexico in 1910, after a decades-long leadership from a nearly dictatorial individual who was considered a positive economic force for some in the upper middle class and the upper class, but a destructive figure for many in his reign that is known sometimes as the Porfiriato. Now, the Mexican Revolution, when it begins, as it expands by 1913, 1914, becomes increasingly violent, including some of the leading figures' assassinations, such as Madero. This will lead the United States to get involved, including landing forces at Veracruz, and will lead to sort of actors from the world over getting involved in the revolution in Mexico, and will leave them in a very interesting position kind of as the war is beginning. Third, the White Feather Brigade. As war was beginning for England, there was a gendered expectation that men should mobilize into the services for war. Those who didn't were shamed publicly for it in many cases, led by suffragists and others in this White Feather Brigade. And the idea was that you would give men who would seemingly be of military age, you would give them this feather, you would do it in public as a way to, again, try to publicly shame them. So the gender politics sort of surrounding that, again, are a part of the sort of English home front experience here. And we'll talk about that more later, because as a concept, it kind of spread not only within England. Fourth, anti-Germanism. Even though the revolution is going on in Mexico, the rest of Latin America has to take positions on this war. And most nations between 1914 and 17 are largely going to be neutral when it comes to involvement in the First World War. Many Latin American nations whose economies had grown in the second half of the 19th century had seen those economies grow by providing raw materials to Europe. Well, if your ability to do that is relatively cut off, then what do? You look for other places to supply, which means you look to, say, for example, the United States, which is what Brazil and others would do. Now, between 14 and 17, then, some Latin American shipping becomes a target of the German navies, particularly the Brazilians. And so as you will eventually start to see declarations of war against Germany, you're going to start to see profound anti-Germanism, including something called the Luxembourg Incident, in Brazil and in Argentina, in which German civilians, German Brazilian civilians, immigrants, first, second generation immigrants, are going to be targeted for discrimination and violence in some cases. Fifth, the Armenian genocide. We don't acknowledge it enough. We should acknowledge it far more. But the backlash against Armenians in modern Turkey existed before 1915, but the systematic brutalization of these people that began in 1915 resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million. It was an effort on the part of leaders in the Ottoman world to sort of cut out the Armenian identity as a part of the larger Ottoman and Turkish identity as well. And the brutal treatment of these civilians is something that scholars to this day, outside of largely recognize as an act of genocide. Now, this isn't to say, of course, that other nations, including the U.S., haven't been guilty of this kind of thing as well, because they have. But it is still a relatively politicized and political act to acknowledge this genocide, especially even within Turkey. Thank you so much.